Hello, everyone. Welcome to another High Country News Summer Reading Event. I'm Michael Schrantz. I've been your host for the summer reading events. I just want to say thank you for everyone for playing along with us this summer. It's been great reading all your submissions, your book picks, everyone who's written in to tell me how much fun you had. It's been great reading along with you. And this is actually our last reading event of the summer, but it's a really great one. We're so happy to have Vauhini Vara here and her really wonderful collection that we're going to be talking about today. So with that, I am going to hand it off. We'll get right into it with High Country News Editor-in-Chief Jennifer Son and Melissa Chadburn, our contributing editor for books, culture, and commentary.
Hi, everyone. Jennifer here. It is my great honor to introduce Vauhini. It is also my great honor to share the stage with Melissa Chadburn, our books, culture, and commentary editor, and a wonderful writer herself. Melissa and I are going to be hosting Vauhini and talking about her new book. Vauhini is a journalist and editor. She's based in Colorado Springs, Colorado.
Fort Collins.
Fort Collins. Oh dear, I'm already off my script. Apologies, Colorado Springs. You don't get to have Vauhini.
That's right.
She is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and a graduate of Stanford. She's the author of numerous stories and essays, including a much-read piece called Ghosts that was published in The Believer, where she used an AI program, one of the predecessors to the much-talked-about ChatGPT, to help investigate her sister's death. So that's a really interesting story that I think landed in Best American Essays, if I remember correctly. She began her career as a tech reporter at the Wall Street Journal in the San Francisco office. She later became a business editor for the New Yorker, launching and editing and writing for their business section of their website. She's been an editor for the New York Times Magazine. She's a contributing editor for Wired Magazine. Her debut novel was a 2023 Pulitzer Prize finalist, The Immortal King Rao. That book was shortlisted for the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize, and won the Colorado Book Award. Just an amazing showing for a first novel. She's involved with the Lighthouse Writers Workshop and the mentorship collective Paraplus. She is here today to talk about her new story collection, This Is Salvaged. Here it is, this beautiful book. It is one of the most anticipated books of the season. It is just out this week, last week, within the last week. Folks can purchase this book from their local bookstores. They can check this book out from their libraries. And if you are interested in a signed copy of the book, you can get that from Old Firehouse Books, Vauhini's local bookstore, oldfirehousebooks.com/salvage-stories/signed. I'll try to repeat that at the end. But first, please, I'm so excited to have Vauhini here and to give a short reading from the book, and then we'll break out into some conversation.
Cool. Thank you for having me, Jennifer and Melissa and High Country News, which published the first long form review of my book, which was exciting for me, by a Paraplus fellow, Hannah Rivers, who is brilliant. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit from a story called The 18 Girls. This is a story about 18 girls who are actually the same girl at different ages. So I feel like that's something that you figure out as you read it when you're reading it, but it would be confusing if I didn't explain that to you before reading. So I'm going to read to you about the 9th, 10th, and 11th girls. After school, her sister made pasta, and they read magazines together. If you wanted to make a boy fall in love with you, her sister explained, you should mirror his behavior. When he lifts his drink, you should lift yours at the same time. This will make him feel on a subconscious level like you are soulmates. They looked up subconscious. the mental activities just below the threshold of consciousness. Consciousness, the quality or state of being aware, especially of something within oneself. They sat on her sister's bed and ate pasta and practiced. Her sister lifted her Dr. Pepper, and the ninth girl lifted her milk. Her sister shoved her finger in her nose, and the ninth said, "Be serious." "It's a load of crap," her sister said, laughing. "Did you really believe it?" She said no, but kept watching to see if her sister believed they were soulmates. "Subconscious," her sister said. "Subconscious," she said. The 10th girl had a disgusting face. Her sister said to think of the most beautiful girl she had ever met, then pretend to be that girl, and after a while she wouldn't have to pretend anymore. She would be transformed. There was nothing wrong with transforming yourself. Life itself, she said, transforms us. In each moment of life, you're slightly different from the person you were a moment earlier. The 11th girl and her sister merged into one person. This person was a 16-year-old girl named Lauren. Lauren had short hair, dyed red, and wore a lip ring. She dressed in cut-off t-shirts that bared her pierced belly button. Her skin was poreless. She was a raver and a recovering cocaine addict. Lauren went into chat rooms for pedophiles. She had cyber sex with them and then tried to persuade them to meet in person. One of them said he would, a 43-year-old man named Eugene. They set a date at the movie theater. Her sister didn't have short red hair or piercings, but she was 14, close enough to 16. They stood in the vestibule of the theater and watched people enter. Men came in, but none were alone. The movie was going to start soon. Then a small boy, maybe 12, sidled over and said to her sister, "Is your name Lauren?" "Who told you to ask me that?" she said. "Is it?" "It is." "I thought you'd be white." Eugene had olive skin and black hair. He might have been Mexican. He wore an Alanis Morissette t-shirt. The three of them watched Batman Forever. Afterward, Eugene told the 11th girl's sister he wanted to kiss her. She said he couldn't. He said she should at least let him touch her. He'd come all the way there. "Fine," she said. "You can touch my stomach, but only if my sister comes with us." They went behind the theater, and her sister rolled up her t-shirt a little. Eugene put his finger in her belly button. "Hey," her sister said, twisting away. "You said it'd be pierced," Eugene said, and he turned and left. "You said you were 43, the 11th girl called out after him. That's it.
I love that. I love how funny that excerpt was. And I love that you read, I had just read that this morning also. And just the sense of humor. And I just wanted to I was going to kick off the questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
There's this, that is captured here for sure. And then there's this great line in the first story. "People don't talk about labial sweat." And I really wanted to say that.
Out loud. Just get it out there.
I love that Hannah Rivers, who wrote a review for this collection, picked up on girlhood and grossness, and that showed up as throughout the collection. And those of you who are watching and haven't read her review yet, she ties in Kristeva's theories of objection. So you should, because it's brilliant. But from the beginning, the funk, like the throw up, the egg rolls, the blood, the boogers, all things gross. It just made me realize that this isn't something that we often get in stories in correlation with girlhood, at least, and so much of girlhood and womanhood is corporal and funky. And so I just wanted to know if you could talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. This almost sounds unbelievable, but this was not something I'd thought about as like a major theme of my collection and not something I'd done explicitly. And when I read Hannah's review, it was one of those, as a writer, like when you read whatever, whether it's a review or just a friend reading your work, it was one of those things where I was like, oh yeah, I can see that, and it led me to kind of revisit the book and sort of like see it through new eyes, which obviously, like, the best criticism, whether it's about your work or somebody else's work, always does. And so I admired that review and appreciated it for how it like made me the author of these books who's been sitting with these stories for like many of them for 10 to 15 years, be like, oh, right, like this is a way to read the book that hadn't occurred to me. That said, that reading that review led me to sort of like think more critically about those themes in the book. So when I was writing the stories, I don't think I explicitly said to myself, like, I'm going to write a book of stories that connect girlhood and the gross, right? But looking back, sort of like looking critically at the stories from where I sit now, having written them and the book being finished, I think, I think of the collection, the thing that I did think of the collection as being explicitly about is about the kind of like porousness between oneself and other people. Not just other people, but like between oneself and the world, the natural world, the animal world. And I think in that space, like there's a sort of natural relationship, I think, between that fact of porousness between oneself and the other or the outside, and like the fact that like ourselves, like our bodies, the physical form we take, are themselves like not fixed, right? Like we have skin that sloughs off and like hair that comes off of us and like liquids that we excrete from our bodies, right? And so I think like on a metaphorical level, it made sense to think of those things, or like for the book to consider those things. So that's one thing that comes to mind. And then the other thing is like the book is also about sort of like the discomfort inherent in like being in a human body and having that human body like exist in relation to the world. And so to that extent too, I think again, like on a metaphorical or symbolic level, I think like bodily grossness is sort of like a useful way, like a sort of useful symbolic manifestation of like the ways in which it feels uncomfortable to be human.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I don't know, and maybe this is another question. I don't know when you were drafting these stories. I think probably over a long stretch of time, but thinking about like, I know just I giggled, even as you were reading just now, I giggled, but a lot of it like requires a little giggling because you're like uncomfortable in that like fun, zhuzhy way. And, thinking about our interconnectedness, like during the early days of the pandemic, just thinking about phenomenology and like how what you breathe out and I breathe in, and like our interconnectedness in that sense, and like where we were especially vulnerable toward one another, but also we're able to like care for one another in new and interesting ways came to mind. But like but I didn't have the opportunity to sort of giggle or engage in that kind of way with other people, I remember walking my dog in the snow, and like all of a sudden I guess like a big chunk of snow fell on my head, and I just started cracking up because like I hadn't been like touched unexpectedly in a long time. And so I felt like that a lot of these stories like hit my funny bone in the way that only human condition or human connection can sort of do that.
Yeah, no, I love that. Like, I love the reason that chunk of snow hitting you made you laugh, right? Like, it's like specifically in the context of the pandemic where you're like, whoa, what was that? Right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not used to that right now.
Yeah. And so I guess like also it felt like sort of because of the relationship with the grossness and girlhood, it did feel like almost like a feminist project or transgressive. I was like, why it and yet it's so human. I mean, it just goes back to that basic like snakes and snails and puppy dog tails. It's like why am I still associating this with boyhood? So that was really interesting. But I also a final question I really want to talk to you about is, I know you're an advocate for equity in publishing. You're a mentor at Lighthouse Writers Workshop and secretary of the Paraplus Collective that mentors writers of color. So Do you have any advice for aspiring writers of color out there who are interested in pursuing this craft?
Ooh, I love that beautiful setup for a very specific thing I want to say, which is that Paraplus, the mentorship collective that I'm involved with and that Melissa is also involved with as a mentor, has its application open right now. And it's a mentorship collective serving emerging writers of color. You can have no credentials other than the fact that you are a practicing writer. You can have a bunch of credentials. It doesn't matter. If you consider yourself an emerging writer, you can apply to Paraplus. The application is at bit.ly, so bit.ly/Paraplus, which is PERIPLUS FAQ. So bit.ly/Paraplus FAQ. You can find it there. In general, I think, when we started Paraplus, we thought of it as a way for established writers like me and Melissa to offer mentorship to emerging writers. I think the more interesting thing that's emerged out of Paraplus than that is what the Paraplus fellows, our mentees, have sort of come up with themselves when it comes to community building and mutual aid and sort of support among themselves, including us. It's sort of become this very sort of non-hierarchical community where I, for example, am learning as much from the fellows as they might be learning from me. Concretely here in reading Hannah Rivers' review of my work, for example, I learned a lot from Hannah. And so I bring that up because Paraplus aside, I think finding mentors, reaching out to people through social media, whatever is useful. But I think even more useful and interesting and enriching, I think, for us as writers is just finding peers who are at the same place in their artistic lives and professional lives as we are, and find people who are interested in your work, interested in the same things, and start sharing work with them. And it doesn't matter whether where any of you are publishing or whether you have degrees or whatever, just find those people by going to readings, by looking online, by joining book groups, whatever, and make those people your friends. That's what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just want to, I'm going to pass it over to Jen, but I just really wanted to thank you for that community. I'm in that sandwich generation, and I've been doing a ton of caretaking. And oftentimes I feel I want to be a writer who caretakes and not a caretaker who writes. And having this community has been lovely. And this story collection has been fantastic. Everybody, I think you need to go read it and share it and then read it again, because I did a second close read and it was just as fun and surprising as the first read. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa.
It's very hard to follow Melissa's questions. I think that first one was the question of the day. I think she worked hard to ask a question that no one else was going to ask you. I think she succeeded in that. I'm going to ask a question that maybe lots of people may have already asked you, which is that you've been in the journalism world for years, and what are the connections between that world and how this book came together? Or what kind of research did you do in writing these stories?
So it's funny because I started writing these stories in graduate school on a break from working as a tech reporter at the Wall Street Journal. I also at that time was starting my novel, The Immortal King Rao, which came out last year. That's it right there on the wall. But so the novel is really explicitly, I think, about the themes that I was interested in as a tech reporter. It's about big tech, it's about capitalism. And I think the stories, I think a careful reader might, I don't want to blame the reader if they don't see this. I think a reader who reads it in a way that's in line with how I'm hoping people read it, which, says nothing about how people need to read it or not. But that kind of reader might notice that that sort of the pressures of global technological capitalism are present in this collection and the stories, and are exerting their force on the characters in the stories. And I think that's very informed by my work as a reporter, because my background is in business journalism. So I'm thinking all the time about those themes. But at the same time, the stories are very intimate, personal stories. They're mostly stories about individual relationships. And so you can read the collection and like just read it as a collection about individual relationships. Like I'm interested always in like that within the context of our sort of like societal pressures bearing down on us.
Yeah, I can see that. I think that leads me into a question I wanted to ask you. Earlier, you made a reference to the porousness between oneself and the natural and animal world. And, you know, these stories very much do center around the dramas playing out in people's lives. Were you thinking deliberately about the role of plants and animals in geography when you were writing them?
In general, no, but in the same way that I wasn't thinking about grossness either, right? Like so much in the writing process, so much of it emerges from the subconscious. But when, again, like looking back on the book and thinking about it, you know, the second book in the story, which is called I, Buffalo, is a story that in which like the sort of the mood of the story as well as the plot of the story relates to this woman who's lost her like sort of corporate lawyer, somewhat exploitative corporate lawyer job in San Francisco, and is wandering around getting drunk and looking at that bison paddock, in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. And like watching these bison and noticing something about like both her relationship as an animal to this animal that's standing there. And then I think also her distance as a kind of human being who's been socialized in the human world, right? Which has distanced itself from the natural world, sort of like noticing the distance between herself and this animal as well. And in some ways, like the story can be read as being about that entirely, right? Like about entirely that sort of like dissociation that humans have had from the natural world to which we belong and that we have exploited as well. There's another story that comes to mind that's set partly in Fort Collins, where I live, and partly in Seattle, about an artist who is concerned with like his climate change is sort of like the central concern, I think, of his artistic life. And he knows that he believes that we're destroying the planet. And if this continues as it's continuing, like we will continue to destroy the planet. And, you know, like our kind of metaphysical sense of like the impermanence of things will become increasingly material. And so he builds these like, these, what's the word, installations that are impermanent. Like he'll build them out of like, again, I guess body stuff, which hadn't occurred to me, but like he'll build them out of like his wife's hair or sand or whatever, dead skin or whatever, as like a nod to the impermanence of things in an era of global climate change. But then he like has this, he's like falls asleep in his car out by the Poudre River in Fort Collins. And when he wakes up, he's had this dream of the river flooding, which is like the main climate threat that we have here in Fort Collins, where I live, is flood. And so he has this dream, and then he decides that he is going to build an ark, like sort of according to the specifications of the Bible, in response to that dream, the ark being like sort of the opposite of these kinds of installations that he's been building in the past, right? Like the ark being sort of like a hopeful response to climate change in a way, right? Like in an artist's mind. I'm not saying like an ark is actually going to save us all, but he has this like artistic idea of an ark as like a kind of counterpoint to what he's been doing. All of which is to say, like, I think in the way that all of us as humans like are concerned with like the bodily, I think all of us are as humans also are impacted by climate change and are concerned with the natural world. And this is like inherent to being human. And so I think like all of that stuff ends up in the book for that reason.
I like to think that all of us are concerned about climate change and animals. I loved I, Buffalo story. That story spoke to me pretty directly. Okay, so here's a question. Most of these stories are set in the West, and you grew up partly in Seattle. You studied at Stanford. You lived in San Francisco. You live in Colorado, Fort Collins. I would say you are a product of the West, and one who's having like really wonderful success in New York publishing circles. And I'm thinking of Wallace Stegner, one of our great Western writers, who struggled to have that, and who was dismissed largely as a Western writer, in quotes, use a term used condescendingly, derogatorily about him. What do you attribute that to? Are you a Western writer? Do you want to be? And why do you think New York is suddenly paying attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of dimensions to that question. I would first say that I identify in so many different ways. You know, I'm Canadian. I was born in Canada, Saskatchewan, Canada, and lived there till I was 10. And then we lived in Oklahoma for 2 years. And then we moved to Seattle before the 8th grade. When people ask me where I'm from, I say Seattle. I identify as like a Californian by virtue of having lived there for a long time, and certainly identify as a Coloradan now. And I'm Indian. I'm Indian American. You know, there are all these different aspects, I think, to how I identify. I wonder, I mean, I think, like, not to make it all about like racial and gender identity, but I think like as a white man, like I feel like the way in which Wallace Stegner felt most marginalized was like as a Western writer, right? But like there are all these sort of intersections these days, right? That exist for those of us in the West or wherever. So that's like one interesting aspect of this. I think I don't know. I mean, maybe this is a glib thing to say. Like, I don't know that I care to like be a flag bearer of any particular identity, including a Western identity. I think the place from which Wallace Stegner was experiencing this was a place in which like the West in general felt marginalized in a world in which I think like the power centers were Washington, D.C. and New York, right? Now in this context, like I think like San Francisco is probably the Bay Area, LA too, to an extent, are probably like more culturally influential than New York, maybe even DC, maybe if you're looking at sort of like how money moves. Which is to say that like there's a sense in which like what constituted the West in Wallace Stegner's age. I mean, he was writing about the early days of Silicon Valley as well, so maybe it's a little facile to say this, but I think like there's a way in which like identifying as a Western writer in Wallace Stegner's day was sort of like identifying as a writer writing outside of a kind of like capitalist tradition, right? Or like a sort of city urban tradition. Whereas now, I don't know that like to be a Western writer means the same thing, right? Like you can be a San Francisco writer who like quit your job as some kind of tech in software engineer, right? And like now you're writing a book and you're living in San Francisco and you're a Western writer. So I think it means something different. I do think that like it's probably still true. I think it's probably still true that like the West, as Stegner conceived of it, is marginal, continues to be marginalized. But when I say the West, I think what I mean is like writing that engages with natural landscapes, right? Or like a kind of non-urban kind of writing, which is sort of like what I associate with Stegner to an extent. And I do think like, I wish that was less. I mean, there are lots of things that I wish were less marginalized in publishing, but like that's one area of experience that I wish were less marginalized.
Yeah, no, I do too. Fiction and nonfiction. We're working on that hard at High Country News.
Oh yeah.
Okay, I've got a writer question for you. Your debut novel was published when you were 39 and ended up a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. This is one of like umpteen interviews, reviews, published interviews that are supporting the publication of This Is Salvaged just a year and change later. For decades, you've been working as a journalist, editor, essayist, novelist, playwright. How does it feel to have your writing thrust into the spotlight so suddenly, so intensely?
Ooh, you know, I think I had like the same existential crisis that I think a lot of writers have when my novel came out. I was like, wait a minute, you're telling me like I can't keep making this better and working on it? I mean, I think that was more the existential crisis than anything else. Like, wait a minute, this has gone from being like a private kind of like living document to something that's like to use the sort of like language opposite of living that's like almost feels dead to me, right? And when it's like published in between these covers, I can't do anything to it anymore. I experienced that last year with my novel for sure. And then I think I was like, all right, yeah, that's how it works. You publish a book and it's done and you move on to the next book. So I think it's an unsettling experience for any writer. And then at the same time, obviously, like what you're sort of always moving toward as a writer, like the idea you have in your mind as a writer, whether you've published your first book yet or not, is like, I want to finish this book and have it published and have people read it. And so it's funny that like that moment actually feels like the death of the book when it's like what's propelling you to write. But I'm doing it right now too. I'm working on my third book. It's due in January. It'll come out in 2025. And like, I'm thinking I've got like that idea of the book being a physical object in the world in my mind as I'm writing. And then I know that when that physical object comes out, I'm going to be like, oh, that book's dead to me now. Like, I need to move on to the next one.
Oh, funny. Being a non-writer myself, just editor 100% through and through. That's interesting because that's when it comes to life for all of us readers.
Right. And for me too, as a reader, Yeah.
Melissa, do you have any words you have any more burning questions for Vauhini?
Yes, I have one final burning question, and then I have to scatter out into the world. But I wanted to ask you, I noticed so you have, I'll just give an example of some of these short sentences that you've got that are they do so much work. She will have to work out the question of her father's trustworthiness, or she puts herself in a strong mood. I felt like there are these, there's something happening here where the cadence was lending itself to building tension. It would be short, long, short, long. And I just wanted to know if you'd be willing to talk about that craft set a bit.
Yes, that's another one of those things that as a writer, I think I'm not particularly aware of when I'm putting it on the page. But as a reader, it can go back and analyze with some more distance. I mean, I think
do you read aloud to yourself, I guess, when you're drafting? Is that part of it, or?
I do sometimes, but I don't have that much of a practice of it. But I think, the thing that matters to me is and I think this will resonate with you, Melissa, just knowing your work is just trying to arrive at some sense of authenticity, just trying to feel like what I'm saying, what I'm writing on the page is not a lie or not a cliche, but is actually true to experience. But then also in the lines that you read, I think those are from the story You Are Not Alone, which is in some ways about performance of selfhood, right? And so there are these declarative sentences, I think, because this character is sort of trying to tell herself about who she is and how she belongs and is situated in the world, right? She's trying to amp herself up. So she's talking to herself in that way. And so I guess to that extent, the way in which that relates to this issue of authenticity is that is the way that I remember hyping myself up when I was a kid, the way in which especially in moments of vulnerability, you use this sort of cheerleaderly, declarative voice to talk to yourself when you feel like your identity feels unstable. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there are sort of different modes of writing throughout the collection, but I think what I was going for in general with whatever the mode was is this true to the actual experience that this character would be going through?
Yeah, thanks. It was just that protagonist in general, or that speaker in general, was so astute with all of her observations. So she's a young girl and she's meeting this stepmom and she's referred to as the stranger the whole story, which I thought was so brilliant. And then but her observations were she seemed like the type of person who thought that M&Ms tasted different based on their color or whatever. And I thought, I'm one of those people. I don't want a bag full of red M&Ms. Like, no, not going to taste the same. So I don't know. I just thought you were, those observations were just so, I felt like the narrator was just like parsing through all the trash of my brain and like honing in on like the exact thing. And so, and throughout the book, all the stories had lines like that where it's just like underlined fully all the way. So thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Jen and leave to go off into the universe. But thank you all so much.
It's so good seeing you, Melissa. Thank you for doing this.
Bye.
Bye, Melissa. Vauhini, do you have any last words you want to share with HCN audience that you've got here in front of you today?
No, I don't think I do, but this has been such a great conversation. So thank you for having me, and it's been a joy. And I love High Country News. I'm so glad it exists. I felt very honored that the first big review of my book was in High Country News. So yeah, thank you for all of that, for existing.
We were so happy to publish that. Melissa is the one who heads up all our books and culture coverage. She's doing an amazing job. I love working with her. And it's really great to get to talk to you. We've talked over the years, but we've never done something like this. So I'm so thrilled to do this with you. And for our listeners out there, please go get Vauhini's collection. This is Salvaged. Library, your local bookstore, or for that signed copy, that link is in the comments to the Old Firehouse books. And thank you so much for being with us today. Don't forget her novel as well, The Immortal King Rao. Really an awesome read. So great to get to talk with you and talk about your work.
Thanks again, Jennifer.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.